Okay, let's go ahead and begin. What I want to do as we start off here is I want you to get the maps that I copied for you and get them in front of you if you can. These will be referred to frequently throughout the study that we have. And as you take a look at this map, I believe I gave you a copy of this map, we see the military campaigns that God directed Joshua to go ahead as they come into the promised land. Now remember that the land has already been divided among the tribes. Don't confuse that with the conquest of the land because it's not the same. Remember that the division of the land of the inheritance was done under Joshua, and this was prior to coming in to the promised land. No, I stand corrected. The division of the land was after these battles that have taken place. But they still have to come in and they have to subdue or remove the inhabitants of the land. Remember, they came in the middle of their inheritance as a nation. And they went after Jericho first and then Ai, and then some of the smaller cities that were there. Then they turned south. I always was under the impression they turned north, but they didn't. They turned south. And I have concluded one of the reasons that maybe they turned south is because as they came up in to the boundaries of the land, they came up from the south end, so they would be familiar with some of these cities already. Once they have conquered the central and the southern, then they turn north and they head to the north. Here is another map that just gives you a different perspective, and it circles the cities that were taken in the middle campaign, then the southern campaign, and then the northern campaign. And so as we come across these judges, you can get a little bit of an idea where they're at. Are they in the center of the inheritance or down south or up north? This is a chart of the judges, starting with the first one going down through and the suggested dates that they ruled and the number of years of peace after they went ahead and delivered the people and rid the land of whatever ites that they were battling against. And you will see several 40s that are there. And I believe that there are certain numbers in the Bible that have significance, and it's called numerology. And 40 is a significant number, meaning something new is about to begin. You have the flood for 40 days and 40 nights. You have Christ being tempted in the wilderness for 40 days. So 40 has the number 40 has the idea of something new is about to take place. And you have this chart, and we will refer to this as we take a look at each one of those judges. Now, I find this one absolutely fascinating myself. When we come to the judges, okay, if you look down on the bottom of your map, or if you're looking at the screen, all the way down on the bottom where it says Derby, Derby, that's Othniel. That's our first judge that comes up in Judges chapter 3. Now, we'll see him in Judges chapter 1 because he will conquer a certain city and receive his cousin as his wife. So that's going to raise one of Karis's question about is that permissible and legal? But we'll talk about that. But I found this map especially interesting because it places the judge in the city and area that he will be used by God to bring about deliverance. As I mentioned in our introduction, sometimes when we think of like Samson as a judge, or Jephthah or Tola as a judge, we think that these people are judging the entire Palestinian area, the entire area that has been given to the nation of Israel by God, but it's not. They are judging only within their area that has been their inheritance. And if you look closely, you will see the boundaries of the inheritance of the tribes. And one thing that you should notice is the expansive tribe of Judah. And then Simon is in, excuse me, Simon is in the lower portion of Judah's inheritance. And when you get into later parts of the Old Testament, in particular the prophecies or the prophets, you will hear the writer talk about Judah, Judah, Judah. Well, Benjamin, because it is so small, not Simon, Benjamin, because it's so small, is encapsulated together with Judah. Simon will be in the lower portion, if you please, of the tribe of Judah's inheritance. On another map, I think, nope, okay, let's back up here. On another map, you can see how small Benjamin is compared to the other tribes. And you will also notice on this map, and it's kind of hard to make out, you might have this in the back of your Bible, but you have Manasseh on both sides of the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River. You got Manasseh on the west and Manasseh on the east. Now remember that Manasseh is the son of Joseph, who married an Egyptian woman. So you have Manasseh on both sides of the Jordan River. So these are just visual aids for us as we try to go through this book and try to keep things in proper perspective of where people are at and what is happening, and in particular what Canaanite tribe that we might be dealing with. When you talk about the Canaanites, they can be subdivided into 7 family clans that make up the totality of the Canaanite nation. They can be broken down to 7 different tribes. And we will see that as we go along and look at the judges. Now, here's another way of taking a look at the judges. You have the judge's name and the tribe that is there. You'll notice that there are 3 judges from the tribe of Manasseh. You have Gideon, you have Jair, and you have Jephthah. You have 2 from Judah, and then the rest are just, individuals from their tribes. You see the enemies that are conquered, and the Philistines seem to be one of the major thorns in the side of the Israelites. You see the number of years of oppression. Now, this is significant to a certain extent. You will notice that there is an increase of captivity as a general rule. Under Othniel, there was 8 years of oppression. Then it jumps up to 18. We don't know how long it was for Shamgar. Deborah was 20 years, and that should be Deborah/Barak. Gideon drops down to 6. Then the other 2, we don't know how long, back up to 16, and down with Samson, 40. And so, as a rule, the oppression, the captivity because of Israel's sin of idolatry and intermarriage, it got seemingly longer and longer as they were taken into slavery. Now, let's take a look at the outline and begin to try to pull this apart. And we're going to try to get through Judges chapter 1 through 20. Now, if you have any questions as we go along, you just need to try to interrupt me. I don't want to get too far down the road if you have a question about one of the maps or something that might be going on in the study here, okay? All right. Now, before we get to God's promise to Judah, go back to Joshua chapter 24. Many times in Jewish literature, they give a summary statement of events, and then they come back later with a little bit more of a detailed explanation of the summary events. And I think we're going to see that here, because in Joshua chapter 2, it records Joshua's death again. Joshua didn't die twice. He just died once. But in Joshua 24, it gives us this information in verse 29. And they came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, and he was 110 years old. And they buried him in the territory of the inheritance in Timnath-Serah, which is in the hill country of Ephraim, on the north of Mount Gash. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders who survived Joshua, and had known all the deeds of the Lord which he had done for Israel. Now you need to mark that. Turn to Joshua chapter 2. In Joshua chapter 2, verse 10. All that generation, referring to Joshua and the elders, all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done. As long as Joshua was alive, he was a stalwart of the faith. He kept them centered on Jehovah and Jehovah's commandments and laws. I believe he might have even reminded them of what we briefly looked at this morning in the Sunday morning service about the blessings and the cursings on Mount Ebal in Deuteronomy chapter 28. Joshua also was the keeper of an additional non-biblical book that recorded the victories that they had over their enemies as he served as an apprentice under Moses. In fact, the scriptures say that he read that book frequently, probably to encourage his heart in difficult times. But I find it interesting that we have one generation, possibly 1.5 generation of godly people, and a generation that grew up that did not know the mighty works of God. They were not taught the mighty works of God. And this can be seen with the church of Ephesus. Paul founded the church in Ephesus, correct? And then he writes a letter back to them. He spent 3 years there. He writes a letter back to them. That's the book of Ephesians. And he says, "Oh, I commend you for your love. It is increasing." And he really heaps on a resume of praise for their spiritual growth and development. Well, Paul commissions Timothy to go back to Ephesus and be the pastor of that church. And you have 1st and 2nd Timothy. And in 1st and 2nd Timothy, you have a litany of decline and problems in the church at Ephesus. Just read 1 Timothy and you will realize how much they had backpedaled, how much they had slid backwards from their moorings. And then when John comes along on the island of Patmos, he writes to them and tells them, "You're neither hot nor cold, you're lukewarm. I'm going to spew you out of my mouth." So what lesson is there for us today? those who come behind us need to know the mighty works of God and what he has done. Maybe not as a nation because we are so far from God, but beloved, in your life and in my life, are we sharing the mighty works of God in our lives with people that God brings across our pathway? Verse 32 of Joshua 24, now they buried the bones of Joseph. Remember, they brought the bones out of Joseph with them when they came out of Egypt, which the sons of Israel brought up from Egypt at Shechem, in the piece of ground which Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money, and they became the inheritance of Joseph's sons. And Eleazar, the son of Aaron, died, and they buried him at Gibeah of Phinehas, his son, which was given him in the hill country of Ephraim. Now go to Joshua chapter 1. Let's begin to take a look at our outline. First point I want to try to bring across to us is God's promise to Judah. Now let's pause here for a moment and think about something. Has God ever broken a promise? And the answer is no. In fact, when we get into the book of Hebrews, one of the verses that should be an encouragement to a Christian, that he swore by two unchangeable things regarding his promise. He doesn't break his word. What happens is his word is not fulfilled, listen to me, until as a rule, his people demonstrate faith and obedience. The children of Israel will never have crossed the Red Sea if Moses did not obey the Lord and pass the rod over the Red Sea. They would not have gone into the promised land under Joshua until the priest's feet touched the water, and then it imparted. Faith is a requirement for God to fulfill his promises. Now, when we come here, God has already told Moses to tell the people while they're down in Egypt, I have given them the land. I will take care of all the ites. They will flee before you. You will possess houses that you have never built. You will enjoy vineyards that you never planted. God kept his promise. He fulfilled everything. And now God tells Judah what to do. Verse 1 of Judges 1. Now it came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? Now remember, we've got 11 tribes here that are going to go to war. Levi did not go to war. They were the priests. They had no inheritance. The tribes were to set up places for them to minister and serve. They also, if you please, monitored and kept the cities of refuge. So they inquire of the Lord. Remember, they got a priesthood here. It's still active and alive. They've got the ephod, but the priest that they might have contacted is unnamed and not even listed here. The point is, they inquired of the Lord. As a nation, they inquired of the Lord, what's our next step? Joshua is gone. The elders are gone that gave us direction. What do we do? Verse 2, and the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Behold, I have given the land into his hand. Now, Judah, as described by Jacob or Israel, was the lion. Judah was the lion, correct? And so you can hypothesize why Judah was to go up first, but God says, I want Judah to go up first. But not only was Judah to go up first, but notice very carefully in verse 2 the promise of God. I have given the land into their hands. It doesn't say I will. It doesn't say I hope so. It doesn't say I'll help them. It says I have given the land into their hand. Hand could be symbolic of authority. Now, verse 3 comes along, and we find Judah making an alliance. Then Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me into the territory allotted me, that we might fight against the Canaanites, and I in turn will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. Is this necessarily wrong that Judah did this? Well, I question why he did it. There's no explanation per se. We know the result of what happened for Judah. And Judah and Simeon, if you take a look at their mother, these are blood brothers. They were born of the same woman. So Judah makes this alliance. Simeon, you come with me, and then I'll go with you, and we'll take care of our inheritance. Verse 4, Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men at Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him. Now, the Hebrew word here for pursue means a constant battle. As he's fleeing, evidently there is a retreat and attack. And Judah and Simeon did not give up. They pursued him. That's the idea behind the word. Caught him. Now watch this. Cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Ouch! Why did they do this? And you see, our liberal friends would point to that and say, you got a vicious God. You got a vindictive God. Why would they cut off the thumbs and the toes? We'll take a look at verse 7. Then Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps under my table, as I have done. In other words, what he's saying is, I did this to 70 kings. I did this to 70 kings. I don't think he's implying what goes around comes around. There's a cultural lesson here. As I have done, so God has repaid me. So they brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. Now, what is the significance of cutting off thumbs and big toes? What is the significance of that? The cultural significance was that if you didn't have your thumbs and your toes, you were no longer effective for military purposes. You were no longer effective for military purposes. So for this king to conquer 70 other kings and cut off their toes and cut off their thumbs demonstrated that he was the more dominant leader in the area. They were disqualified. They could not be a figure, if you please, of military strength. And so it was done to him. Verse 8, then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. After the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev and in the lowlands, so Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba, and they struck Shisha and Iman and Telmah. Now, here's where it gets a little bit interesting. Then from there, he went against the inhabitants of Deborah, and you can look that on your map. Now the name of Deborah formerly was Kiriath Sepher. And Caleb. Wow, where did we hear this name before? Caleb was one of the 2 spies that came back with the other 10. He and Joshua were the only 2 spies that said, what? Come on, we can take the land. Don't listen to the majority. God said we can take the land. Let's go. What's your problem? Get up, move. Caleb survived the 40 years of death march for everybody 20 and older who refused to enter the land by faith. And Hebrews refers to this, I believe, in chapter 4, admonishing us that we enter our rest by faith and obedience, unlike the children of Israel. So Caleb said, the one who attacks, now he's an older man now. By the way, when he went to possess his land, he and Joshua are in their 80s. 80s. They're not claiming Social Security yet, guys. They're in their 80s. And Caleb said, the one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will even give him my daughter Achshash for a wife. Wow. That's like one of us saying, if you win the lottery, I will give you my daughter in marriage. What right does a father have to make such a promise? Our modern liberal friends would say, foul, foul, you can't do that. You're impinging upon her rights. You're treating her like a slave. No, that's wrong. Remember the culture, beloved. Remember the culture here. This was a patriarchal society. Patriarchal means it was run by the father. Everybody from the father's descendants, even if they were married and on their own, you think of Jacob and Esau and others, the father had the last word about what to do. And so culturally, this is perfectly permissible for this to take place. Now, here's a sidebar that's not in the scriptures. She must have been one good-looking woman, because I wouldn't go to war over somebody I didn't want to live the rest of my life with. And so, verse 13, Othniel, the son of Kenzah, Caleb's younger brother, captured it, so he gave his daughter Achish for a wife. Now, it appears, if you do the genealogy, and I'm not real good at this stuff, but what I seem to see here is that we have a younger brother, Caleb's younger brother, marrying Caleb's daughter. So you have a intergenerational marriage between nephew and niece or cousins. See, that's where I get mixed up on the generation. But that's what seems to be taking place here. That's what seems to be taking place. Now, they are blood relatives, but they are not from the same clan, if you please. Let me read you an explanation that I think makes sense. Reading from Joshua, the one who attacks Kiriath Sepher and captures it, I will give him Achish, my daughter, as a wife. So Othniel volunteers. Now his relationship to Caleb is what? A younger brother. But notice his lineage in verse 13. Othniel, the son of Kenza. Joshua is the son of, Caleb is the son of Jephunneh. Jephunneh. The scriptures that verify that are Joshua 15:17. Joshua 14 verse 6, 13 through 14. Then again in 15:13, and then again in 21:12. He's not of the same father, of the same tribe, if you please, but not of the same father. They can be brothers from different, clan maybe? Now, another thing that might be considered here is that not everything listed in the Bible is condoned by God. Even if this was an incestuous marriage that took place because of Caleb, it doesn't mean that God approved it. In fact, the Levitical law disapproves incestuous relationships. Leviticus 18, 6 through 7. So, because many scholars believe because there's a difference in the name, their last name, where they come from, accounts for the legitimacy of this, or that this is simply a fact that the Holy Spirit allowed to come into the canon, but is not condoning it. God doesn't hide the sins of his people. He's not condoning this. He doesn't condone polygamy, but he certainly recorded it. And so we have this marriage that takes place. Verse 14, then it came about when she came to him, who? The daughter came to him, what? Caleb, her new husband, or her husband, that she persuaded him to ask her father, Caleb, for a field. She gets off of her donkey, and Caleb said to her, what do you want? And she said to her, give me a blessing, since you have given me the land of the Negev. Give me also the springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs. Now, let's see if we can picture this, okay? She's married Caleb's younger brother, Othniel. They approach Caleb. Caleb says, what do you want? And she says, well, you've given me an inheritance. Now, I couldn't quite figure out exactly what that meant unless she was talking about that which was captured by Othniel, and she's speaking as one flesh here, because women were not allowed to possess land. And so she approaches her dad and says, hey, look, you've given us this inheritance, and that inheritance, if you take a look at a map, is a dry, arid piece of land. It's trying to farm in the Mojave Desert. Just dry, brutal area. But on either side of their inheritance, there are springs. And she is simply saying, you've given us this inheritance. Now we really want to go ahead and see it flourish. Give us title to the upper springs and the lower springs, so the land can be watered and it can grow and flourish. Verse 16. The descendants of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law. Now, remember that? Who was Moses' father-in-law? Who was Moses' father-in-law? Do you remember?
Jephthah. Am I pronouncing it right?
Jethro.
Jethro.
Jethro was Moses' father-in-law. He took care of Moses' wife and children while Moses was out being a militant. And so he is a Kenite. He was of a priestly background. He was the one that came to Moses and observed him and said, "You're going to kill yourself by sitting here all day long ruling these people." I think that's Exodus 18 or 19. I'm not quite sure. And he tells Moses, "I think you ought to do this. Appoint godly men, put them in charge over 50 and 20 and 10, etc. Let them deal with the everyday common problems, the big ones they bring to you for God's wisdom on how to resolve the problem." That's the background here. The descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of the palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad, and they went and lived with the people. Now there's your first red flag. They went to live with the people. I thought God gave them specific instructions on how to take possession of the land. And you can read about this in Deuteronomy. They were to lay siege to the city. They were to offer the city terms of peace that included servitude. It's like we have been given Bradford County, and so we are going to lay siege to Dewshore. This is a pretty silly illustration because I don't know if there's anything in Dewshore I want to lay siege to, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point. And we would lay siege to that city. In other words, we would surround it, and the borough president would come out, and we would say, "Hey, look, Joe, you either come and serve us, or we're going to burn your city down and kill everybody in it." See, that's important to remember because that's what the Gibeonites feared. That's what the Gibeonites feared, and they pretended that they were from a faraway country, and Joshua didn't even read the handwriting on the wall. Then Judah went, 17, with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephah and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And Judah took Gaza with its territory and Ashkelon. You're going to remember those names because that's going to be an area where Samson is going to have some womanizing problems. And Judah took Gaza and its territory, and Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory. Those are all along the I want to say Mediterranean, the sea there to the left on your map. Okay, my mind's going blank. I'm sorry. Verse 19. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but you got to watch out for the buts in the Bible. Some are good buts, some are bad buts. This is a bad but. Why? They could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Okay, I'm kind of confused here. Because back in chapter 1, verse 2, God said, "Judah shall go up. I have given the land into his hand." And now you come to verse 20, they couldn't drive out the inhabitants of the land because they had iron chariots. So I guess the iron chariot is stronger than the omnipotent God. And Judah and all of Israel had seen the power of God in battle. One of the incidents that comes to my mind is when Joshua was fighting And Moses was up on the hill. Remember that? And when he held up his hands, Israel had victory. They could advance. But Moses got tired and he couldn't hold up his hands. So they got a rock. Moses sat down and they held up his arms. And as long as they held up his arms, Israel advanced. But it was getting dark. Oh my goodness, what will happen? God stopped the sun. Remember that? God stopped the sun so they can have victory. They failed in their task. God said, I'm going to give it to you. They went as far as they thought they could go. And they quit. They gave up. And what concerns me is that they lived with the citizens of that area. God had specifically said in the law that they should not commingle with those that were not committed to Jehovah God. They were not to intermarry. They were not to attend dinners. They were not to go to the theater with them. They were not to go bowling if they had bowling back then. But you understand what I'm trying to say. They thought, okay, well, at least we got the land, and the people don't seem to be giving us very much problem. My goodness, doesn't that ring a bell in your head, that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? A little tolerance of sin not only permeates the person's life who is committing the sin, and they can tolerate it quite a bit because they come up with justifications. But you know what? It affects other people. It affects other people. As a rule, we do not sin unto ourselves. Our sin primarily oftentimes is against ourselves, but there is splash over, there is spill over, and it touches other people's lives. How is this possible? Well, we have someone who is financially irresponsible and plunges his family into debt. That's his problem, right? No. Now the wife has got to figure out, how can I take half of what he was giving me to operate the house? How am I going to handle the doctor's appointment and the medical test revealing that my child needs to have Lantus because he's a diabetic? How do I afford that medication when my husband is gambling it away and drinking it away? And when confronted, he comes home and he cries and he cries and he says, I'll never do it again. But he does every time he gets a paycheck. You see, sin has a ripple effect. It has a ripple effect. Now, next week, we are going to take a look at the failure of the other tribes in Judges chapter 1, 21 to 38. If you care to look ahead to that, I will try to send you your outline to that. Thoughts or questions that you might have? Hey, Jody, good to have you tune in here.
Thanks, Pastor. Good to be here.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else or any questions or anything that you might have?